Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to discuss Fredric Jameson's paper, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. Fredric Jameson is a really important theorist of the postmodern, and this essay is extremely influential in the study of postmodernism. And Jameson comes from a Marxist perspective, where he wants to understand postmodernism not as some coherent movement with an explicitly delimited aim, but rather it is defined by the lack of the ability to create and communicate a coherent message through the results of the development of capitalism and the material conditions of society, leading to a new cultural dominant that is postmodernism. So Jameson wants to understand postmodernism as a response to economic and cultural conditions, and particularly to the fragmentation of the self that comes from the increasingly globalized extent and scope of the world. We see this in postmodern literature with the characteristic fragmentation of narrative and image. We will have points that don't always seem to lead back into some coherent narrative will oftentimes have seemingly denseless characters. And this fragmentation is the result of cultural and economic material conditions of production. For example, the global market, telecommunications, social media, profit-based news, the reproduction model of industry. And Jameson sees this as part and parcel of commodity culture. He writes that what has happened is that aesthetic production today has become integrated into commodity production generally. The frantic economic urgency of producing fresh waves of ever more novel-seeming goods, from clothing to airplanes, at ever greater rates of turnover, now assigns an increasingly essential structural function and position to aesthetic innovation and experimentation. In other words, aesthetic production has been co-opted by the market and is now a commodifiable form of exchange. He continues that this whole global yet American postmodern culture is the internal and superstructural expression of a whole new wave of American military and economic domination throughout the world. In this sense, as throughout class history, the underside of culture is blood, torture, death, and horror. And this is his classic Marxist framing coming into frame here. That we have an economic base consisting of the material conditions of production and the ownership and maintenance of the means of production, and then we have cultural and ideological factors serving as the superstructure, the symptom of this economic base. Thus, when the economic base changes and the methods by which it expands and governs its territory, thus the superstructure will change too. So the rise of American hegemony leads to domination and exploitation that is really formative for postmodern works, and we can see this in something like Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, where he links technological and economic advances to their material effects on exploited laborers in, for example, the Nazi concentration camps building the V-2 rockets, pillaged natives via colonialism in West and Central Asia, globalized systems of cultural and economic interdependence, such as the military-industrial complex, which hinges on expansion of capital and markets and the motivation of conflict to enter new burgeoning markets. So all of these economic factors are intimately important for understanding postmodern philosophy and literature. And this accumulation of more and more goods of ever-expansive markets and territories leads to the global expanse of the world and really the breakdown of the nation-state. The nation-state is no longer an effective locus for understanding the way things are. We have to zoom out even further to these dynamics of massive global commodity production. And this accretive model of aesthetics leads to a cultural dominant defined by having no single cultural dominant. It is a lack of culture, which is our culture. Therefore, It must copy aesthetic and cultural models from the past, known as pastiche. And pastiche is one of these really important concepts that Jameson introduces here, which is a way of copying a form that's similar to parody, but without the normative or moral imperative. It's not good or bad reproduction or borrowing. It simply is. He writes, "In this situation, parody finds itself without a vocation. It has lived, and that strange new thing, pastiche, slowly comes to take its place. Pastiche is like parody, the imitation of a particular, peculiar mask, speech in a dead language. But it is a neutral practice of such mimicry without any of parody's ulterior motives, amputated of the satiric impulse, devoid of laughter and of any conviction that alongside the abnormal tongue you've momentarily borrowed, some healthy linguistic normality still exists. Pastiche is thus blank parody, a statue with blind eyeballs." So pastiche is a way of digging into the past in order to come up with something new, which is akin to recycling, rather than the genuine production of new cultural aspects. Think of the resurgence of the 80s aesthetic in something like Stranger Things, or the popularity of the early 2000s aesthetic. Our culture becomes one of recycling older ones in order to try to find some ground. Pastiche relies on the past, but not in a way that betrays depth. Rather, history is used as an empty but necessary refuse or receptacle, kindling for a dying flame to keep going a little longer. No longer the romantic flame of inspiration, creation, authenticity, or ecstasy, but a dull, pragmatic survival tool. Now, aesthetically and methodologically, postmodernism criticizes the modernist conception of the self or the subject as interior, and this is an important aspect of Jameson's paper that really tracks the overturning of subject-object dualism, so central to modernist thinking, starting with Descartes. Because the way Descartes thinks of us, we are thinking things. What it is to be is essentially an interior phenomenon of representing a world outside the mind and focusing on the appearance of these images and trying to find certain deductive knowledge based on essentially bracketing the world, as Husserl would put it. Therefore, postmodernism reacts to this and denies this neat division between the self and society, for example, this interior versus the outside of the society I'm within, since both mutually interpenetrate and depend upon one another. I am insofar as I am a member of society, but society is insofar as it is a collection of individuals, of parts. So along with this collapse of the self, comes the collapse of a number of concepts that really depend upon this conception of the self. For example, authenticity of my true essence, style, my unique trace left in the art, expression, which is the making external of what is truly experienced and felt on the inside, alienation, which is the existential rift that prevents me from articulating and living my authentic selfhood in the external world, and signification, that is, saying what I really mean. All of these become problematized when the difference between subject and object is blurred, because we can't abstract ourselves away to find our authentic selves. If it is anywhere, it is deeply social and contingent and blurry. He writes that the very concept of expression presupposes indeed some separation within the subject, and along with that a whole metaphysics of the inside and the outside, of the worldless pain within the monad and the moment in which, often cathartically, that emotion is then projected out and externalized as gesture or cry, as desperate communication and the outward dramatization of inward feeling. Right? This is the romantic conception, where through a careful aesthetic project, we build up some sort of cosmic, transcendent scream that allows us to authentically express what's been inside of us, yet alienated all along by culture. And this combination of decentering and fragmentation, pastiche, and the collapsing of the inside-outside, among other binaries, leads to a conception of history in which the past is constantly leached and simultaneously at a loss of depth. History, the means by which we ground and articulate the present, becomes problematized to the point of unrecoverability. History becomes an artifice, something produced, an industry, just like the news or a factory assembly line. Jameson speaks of the disappearance of the historical referent. The historical novel can no longer set out to represent the historical past. It can only represent our ideas and stereotypes about that past, which thereby at once becomes pop history. Cultural production is thereby driven back inside a mental space which is no longer that of the old monadic subject, but rather of some degraded collective objective spirit. It can no longer gaze directly on some putative real world, at some reconstruction of a past history which was once itself a present. Rather, as in Plato's cave, it must trace our mental images of that past upon its confining walls. If there's any realism left here, therefore, it is a realism which is meant to derive from the shock of grasping that confinement, and of slowly becoming aware of a new, original historical situation in which we are condemned to seek history by way of our own pop images and simulacra of that history, which itself remains forever out of reach. All of this accumulates in a crisis in which we're inundated and overwhelmed with myriad images, none of which are properly real, bestowing, for example, an obvious meaning and groundedness. Instead, since the products we interact with are the result of complex material processes of production, in which, for example, labor is outsourced to countries across the globe, in this case, we literally cannot recover the material historical ground upon which our commodities and images depend and come from. Therefore, we enter into the scheme of hyper-reality, as Baudrillard puts it, which is a paradigm of images and copies without originals. It creates a sense of inflated and unmappable space called hyperspace by Jameson, in which the boundary between public and private, high and low, is effaced in favor of a seamlessly mobile spatial conglomerate, which Jameson discusses in this paper regarding a number of architectural creations. And because of technology which serves to globalize the scope of communication and trade and conflict, this creates a lot of paranoia and conspiratorial thinking, which is part and parcel of postmodern literature, seen in, for example, Thomas Pynchon's Crying of Lot 49. Jameson writes that our faulty representations of some immense communicational and computer network are themselves but a distorted figuration of something even deeper, namely the whole world system of present-day multinational capitalism, the entire market. The technology of contemporary society is therefore mesmerizing and fascinating, not so much in its own right, but because it seems to offer some privileged representational shorthand for grasping a network of power and control even more difficult for our minds and imaginations to grasp, namely the whole new decentered global network of the third stage of capital itself. High-tech paranoia, in which the circuits and networks of some putative global computer hookup are narratively mobilized by labyrinthine conspiracies of autonomous but deadly interlocking and competing information agencies, and a complexity often beyond the capacity of the normal reading mind. Yet conspiracy theory and its garish narrative manifestations, such as Lot 49, must be seen as a degraded attempt through the figuration of advanced technology to think the impossible totality of the contemporary world system. In other words, our conspiratorial thinking is oftentimes a way to try to grasp the exigency of current powers, to try to imagine the genuinely global extent which is beyond human intellect. All of this is a way to deal with being overwhelmed and decentered, unable to find oneself, feel grounded. And with this comes a lack of what Jameson calls critical distance. We become so inundated with constantly moving, working, communicating, identifying, that we don't get the distance necessary to form a hermeneutic project. He says that distance in general, including critical distance in particular, has very precisely been abolished in the new space of postmodernism. We are submerged in its henceforth filled and suffused volumes to the point where our now postmodern bodies are bereft of spatial coordinates, and practically, let alone theoretically, incapable of distantiation. Meanwhile, it has already been observed how the prodigious new expansion of multinational capital ends up penetrating and colonizing those very pre-capitalist enclaves, nature and the unconscious, which offered extraterritorial and Archimedean footholds for creative effectivity. In other words, the refuse of the solely interior, or the pure outside of nature, are now constantly being capitalized and commodified to the point where we have, for example, this showing up in postmodern literature in its most obvious form, where formal and narrative means are used in which the reader is not above or outside the text, but this critical distance is abolished and one becomes amidst and entrenched within the text, such that the modernist mode of objective appraisal through critical distance is no longer possible. We can't even get clarity on some of the most basic aspects of character, such as intention or affective states, or emotions, or capacities, or goals, or a historical layout of what happens during or before or after the novel. All of this serves as Jameson's way of talking about the way that economic and cultural conditions at the very base of society that allow for the movement, commodification, and reproduction of images and objects manifests itself symptomatically with postmodernism, such that this is not really a choice so much as a forced open-air medium in which we feel boxed in and yet at the same time bereft of space entirely. This is just a short summary of what goes on in this essay. It's 40 pages, so I just chose to focus on some of the main topics, but hopefully this helps give you some context of what's going on in this essay. I definitely recommend you read it, although it's very dense, and I'm sure there's plenty of stuff to help online. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you just like to donate a single time to the channel, because it helps take some pressure off me, and I really appreciate everyone who reaches out and helps financially. But no worries. Care for yourself. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.